Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to be talking about Edge's biography on WWE A&E, and we're going to be honest, there's a major piece of this story missing. They replaced, some interesting stuff to make a whole new story. And they've done biographies on Edge before. They've done documentaries on Edge before. And there's one on DVD that I'm sure that I have. There's also The Second Mountain that was on the network. I don't think there was another one that was also on the network. So they took this opportunity to sort of surgically remove Lita from this biography. There's no Lita whatsoever in this biography. Now she shows up in Rivals, the episode with Edge and John Cena. She doesn't show up at all. The situation with Matt Hardy doesn't show up at all in this biography. That is the one thing that I say, come on, man. Come on, man. They replaced the talking about Lita with talking about his mom. And that is a positive because they gave his mom a lot more credit for his success. And they also talked more about his relationship with Bret Hart, which I didn't know anything about. I knew about one of these things. I didn't know about the rest of it. So this is very interesting. So it was a very interesting biography, but if you were looking for salacious details about Lita and Edge, it's not here. So they talked a lot about his home life, growing up without a dad, him single mom, growing up poor. So they really set the stage for his mom instilling in him his work ethic. And they really pooled their money together to get him to Maple Leaf Gardens to see his first wrestling show. And they actually had footage from his first wrestling show at Maple Leaf Gardens. And it was really great footage. I don't know if WWE owns the rights to Maple Leaf Gardens or maybe they just leased it for this documentary. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think so. I don't think they own the rights to the Maple Leaf Gardens was the Toronto territory, which I think was owned by the Tunnies. And Vince did buy out the Tunnies, but I don't think he bought out their library. I'm not sure. So he met Jay Christian when he was 11 years old. Jay had just moved to Orangeville. Basically he was shy, didn't know anybody. And Adam was one of the kids that the teacher sent over to sort of help him matriculate into the population. And they bonded over wrestling. And they say basically Jay's family took Adam in. And, even though he didn't have money, he did stuff with them. And so he went to family trips and was able to stay over at his house. And together they started trying to manifest becoming tag team champions because they were really strong believers and lovers of wrestling. It talked about, obviously, Edge going to WrestleMania 6. His mom had borrowed her parents' credit card and just promised to pay them back just to get him to that show. And there's footage of him there, which is always very nice to see. It's amazing how WWE has so much. They will do that. They will comb through hours and hours and hours of footage to find a glimpse of a guy who is currently on the roster in the crowd at one point. Or they will do whatever it takes to find a picture of this guy being a fan first. And it's very important because you see that Edge was a super fan as a kid, but nothing involving his character it was my dream, it's my dream, it's my dream. He was just doing it, And then over time, you started to see how much of a super fan he was, that he was going to these shows, even when he was poor. He didn't have any money. So this was really good stuff. And, a Hogan super fan. Of course, we talked about him becoming tag team champions with Hulk Hogan later. There was no real reason for it. I didn't hear any good reason for why they should be tag team champions. They just were. But it was just a way of Vince trying to get Edge over. And that kind of becomes another one of the things, like when we start talking about WWE a little bit, that, they struggled to figure out who Edge was and how to get Edge over as a singles act. But back to the story. So there was a writing contest, an essay contest for young aspiring wrestlers who want to be trained by Sweet Daddy Siki and Ron Hutchison. So Edge wrote this letter. He said he ain't never seen it, but he wrote it, sent it in. Ron Hutchinson still had it, which was great. And he read pieces of it. Sweet Daddy Siki did not appear. I think he's still alive. He's black too, by the way. For a lot of people who may not know, Sweet Daddy Siki is black. And we don't see him at all in this. It would have been nice for him to be here, but I guess Ron Hutchinson did most of the training, I guess. Now, in Edge's book, he talked a little bit more about the training and about some situations that I think was very interesting. He said that he got called to the office after he won the essay contest. Well, he also mentioned that Christian was supposed to write an essay as well, but he backed out and didn't actually enter training until 2 years later or something like that. So Christian kind of dragged his feet. But he had gotten a call from Sweet Daddy Siki and Ron Hutchinson to come and train. And then he said that, quote, in the corner of a large room filled with boxing equipment was the ring. It was actually a boxing ring that doubled as a wrestling ring on weekends. There were several students doing their thing, which fascinated me, but I was called into the office where Siki and Ron were waiting. Little did I know that I was about to enter the final stage of the contest. Ron and Siki told me to have a seat and proceeded to hurl horror stories at me to really test my ambition. Being an African-American wrestler in the 60s with a blonde afro, Siki had experienced some tough times. He ate out of the dumpster, slept in the alleys, and made no money. He said that all could happen to me unless I really wanted it. Oh, how I wanted it. It was the final test and I passed it. They let me sweat for a week, but I won the contest. Free training. The training otherwise would have cost $3,000. For a single-parent household, that would not have been possible. So winning the contest was a godsend. Thanks to Ron and Siki, I was on my way. So this is an excerpt from his book. I forgot to tell you I did my job this week. I actually read pieces of this book. But then, of course, you already know I read pieces of this book because I did it for other things, I think. So I read pieces of the book. I went back to it. And so he started in his training situation. So he had his first match in 1993 in front of a crowd. He actually had footage. I don't know how these guys managed to keep this stuff, but Edge still had the tapes from his very first match. It was very interesting stuff. But it was a little bit of an underground show that Ron and Siki had put on at the time. So that was interesting stuff. So while he's on tour, he's, an aspiring wrestler. He's doing really small shows. He gets the opportunity to go on the Deanie Petty show, which is, as he says in the book, is the Canadian version of Oprah. And he goes on this show. He gets an opportunity to ask Bret Hart a question. And WWE obviously found the footage. I think they've showed this footage before of Edge asking Bret Hart, what does it take to sort of make it? And Bret basically told him he needed to get more experience. And afterwards, they talked backstage and Bret wanted to explain a little bit more about what to do and kind of apologize, face to face, and kind of told him just he needed to stick with it. So that's what he decided to do. So at this point, Edge is in college. He's doing radio broadcasting as a plan B, even though there was no real plan B. He wanted to be a wrestler, and that's all he wanted to do. But more importantly, he was using his student loan money to pay for wrestling training and for travel, which Christian was also doing. And this is hilarious because there's a lot of misappropriation in those student loan funds, but this is in Canada, so I cannot complain too much about what the Canadian taxpayer has to go through. But this was interesting. So the Sexton Hardcastle days, he's wrestling under this name when he meets Carl DeMarco. Now, the Carl DeMarco thing is something I completely memory hold because I did read Edge's book. But just because I read a thing doesn't mean I remember it, which is, entirely true. But Carl DeMarco worked for WWE Canada and was Bret Hart's manager. So he was sort of the bridge between the two. And DeMarco is the guy who would be instrumental in getting him into WWE. So after he does these death tours, as he's going into the most Canadian parts of Canada to do the wrestling shows, driving over frozen lakes and doing all that kind of stuff, he gets an opportunity to go work a WWF show in Hamilton, Ontario. So because it wasn't really documented that well in the biography, I'm going to do go into Edge's book a little bit and say what he did in Hamilton. So he says, my opponent that night was Bob Hardcore Holly, although at that point he was still the spark plug, checker flag, tights and all. I arrived at the building 3 hours before the show, not realizing that for non-televised events, the guys show up about an hour before bell time. This gave me enough time to get good and nervous. Our match was scheduled first. The show started at 7:30 p.m. Bob, who showed up at 7 p.m., walked up to me and asked how long I had been working. I replied with the truth, 3.5 years. I realized that honesty might not have been the wrong approach when Bob rolled his eyes, grunted, and walked away. Knowing Bob the way I do now, I'd laugh. Back then I said, shit, but vowed to prove that I belonged in the ring with him. They asked me my ring name, and timidly I said Sexton Hardcastle. That raised some eyebrows and guaranteed all the guys would be watching to see what I could do. I was nervous as hell. Who wouldn't be? I was the new kid, a 22-year-old greenhorn. Jake the Snake Roberts, Razor Ramon, Vader, Ultimate Warrior, and all the rest were there to see if I would sink or swim. I was ready to show them I could swim nearby Lake Ontario. So, he had to prove himself. You know, he's in a tryout match with Bob Holly, and he's basically just going to be a bit of a job guy. And at the end, he feels like he's won Bob over. So, but he doesn't offer the job, because this would be in like 1995, right? As the Bob Sparkplug Holly gimmick is going on right now. So this wouldn't entirely be, well, this is 96, I think. So it would have been early 96. So things aren't exactly, it's going better than he'd hoped, but it's not doing too well. In the biography, they talk a lot about him getting scammed in Tennessee, where him and Christian made a dummy mission down to Tennessee. I mean, are you really a young man if you don't go on a dummy mission every once in a while and do something stupid? So he apparently got stuck in Tennessee after he was promised 30 shows in 30 days, and his mom had to bail him out, and he ends up coming back to Canada. Now, here's another interesting thing that involves Carl DeMarco, is that now he's going to get an opportunity to train with Bret Hart. So in the book, he says, Carl had an idea. The World Wrestling Federation champion Bret the Hitman Hart had gone down with a knee injury and subsequent surgery. Carl thought it would be a good idea for me to head out to Calgary and show Bret what I could do in the ring. It sounded like a great idea, except for the obstacles in my way. My voyage wouldn't be smooth. I had no car and not enough funds to fly there, so my mom and grandparents pitched in the rest. So thanks to my family, I was on my way to the home of Stampede Wrestling. And here is the interesting thing about training at Bret's house that he talked about in the book that I didn't remember, and what wasn't mentioned in the biography. It says, I had 2 full weeks in Calgary before a full summer of bookings in the Canadian Maritimes. Bookings were becoming easier to get as word got around about this kid from Toronto that the World Wrestling Federation was interested in. But before that, I had 2 weeks to try and impress Bret. He had a ring set up at the end of his indoor swimming pool. There were already a few guys training there under the tutelage of Bret and Leo the Lion Burke. Ken Shamrock and Mark Henry were there, brand new to the business and being put through the process, or through the paces. I can't remember everyone who was there, but I quickly noticed one guy, in a very manly way, of course. In particular, he was tall, had a good build, and long blonde hair. The guy was Andrew Test Martin. At this point, he never had a match, but after sizing each other up, we clicked real good in the ring. Good enough that Bret told me to come back after my summer tour of Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling. So Sexton Hardcastle. His name is being spoken around the business. You know, the WWF is coming sniffing around to see if he's any good. And because of that, his bookings are increasing, which is a good thing, of course. The problem with this is that, you know, the Sexton Hardcastle name kind of sucks. It sucks very hard. But, of course, he's a kid. He doesn't really know that. Interestingly enough, during this time, from the book, we learned that he was working these shows. He's working with Don Callis and Rick Martel. Rick the Model Martel. He wasn't known as the Model at the time. You know, this was in the mid-90s, so that gimmick is over. But Don Callis, and he's working with those guys, and they're working as a tag team. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. He's really getting some good experience. He's getting in there with some guys who got some time under them, some guys who got names. So it's really kind of starting to work out for him. So after that, after he worked those tours, he goes back to Brett's place to train. And now he's living with Michelle Billington, who is his sister-in-law, Brett's sister-in-law, because she's married to the Dynamite Kid. Remember that. So he's living in her basement, and they're continuing to train at Brett's house. And Brett kind of gives them the idea near the end that he's going to talk to JR about getting them a job in WWF. So he says, by the end of the 2 weeks, Brett told me, I'm going to talk to JR. I think you're ready. This was a man I watched take part in some of the best matches I'd ever seen. And he was telling me I was ready. Not only that, but I had World Champ going to bat for me to get a contract. I shook his hand and thanked him profusely. Jay and I headed to Winnipeg for our upcoming tour. They were wrestling as the Suicide Blondes. And he had actually talked Bret Hart into letting Christian come wrestle with them and come train with them because, he wasn't really there at first. So it was like a thing where he just kind of had to get his foot in the door, and then he was able to pull Christian in. So that would become another running theme throughout their careers. And since he was in WWE, he was a part of the first Funka Dojo. And I know I probably talked about this before, but for those of you who, this might be your first video, let's go through the Funka Dojo, what it is. So the Funka Dojo was a WWE developmental system. It is not quite the first, but it's their first in-house developmental system, where they took a couple of wrestlers that were kind of on the cusp, and they sent them to Stanford to train in a warehouse with Dory Funk Jr. And here is what Edge had to say about it. I had been on my developmental contract for almost a year when I received a call to go back to Stanford for the first ever Funka Dojo. It was a training camp run by Dory Funk Jr. and Tom Pritchard, set up for signed and unsigned talent to show their skills. It was a refresher course for some guys. The office felt needed it. The camp included myself, Rodney Blackbeard, Glenn Kolka, Kurgan, Ahmed Johnson, Tiger Ali Singh, Darren Drozdov, Mark Henry, Sean Stasiak, Mark Merrow, Taka Michinoku, Matt Bloom, who is A-Train, who now teaches people in NXT, and once again, the forever reappearing Sean Morley, because Sean Morley appears a lot here, because he's also from Canada, so he knows like almost all of the Canadian wrestlers. So he says, the first day of camp was tough. Dory Funk Jr. is a former NWA World Champion and a legend in the wrestling business. He's a class act, but he and Tom Pritchard were tough trainers. And they had us taking about 100 bumps that first day. It seemed everyone was getting discouraged. He said, that night we were licking our wounds in the hot tub. We decided we were going to bust our asses and give our best, and give the company no choice but to put us on TV. Day after day, we were up at 6 a.m., breakfast at 7 a.m., in the gym by 9 a.m., and over the studio after lunch for bumps galore. Not to brag, just straight facts. One day, they paired us against Tiger Ali Singh and Ahmed Johnson. By saying us, he means Sean Morley, a.k.a. the future Val Venus. And he says, to be honest, neither were good workers, but Sean and I knew we had our work cut out for us. It was another test. And you know what? We pulled it off and had a decent match with them. Bruce Pritchard was there that day, and he and Dory and Tom pulled us aside. They told us that we were the two from the class that were shining, and it was time to get us on TV. They just needed to work out our characters. At first, our names were thrown around with the new Midnight Express. Anything new in wrestling as a kiss of death. Adorable Adam and sensual Sean never saw the light of day, and we dodged that bullet. So they were supposed to be a tag team, Val Venus and Edge, which was very interesting. So about 4 months later, it took forever for them to come up with characters. Edge then wrote, Sean had started taping vignettes as Val Venus, a former porn star turned wrestler. I always based Sex and Hardcastle on that premise and thought I could do quite a bit with that character. I'm glad I wasn't saddled with it. After you sleep with every woman in the company, where do you go? Instead of a porn star, I became Edge, a tortured soul. That was it. I had no clue what the hell that meant, and I really didn't think that anyone else did either. My vignettes involved me running around the streets of New York, beating people up, and no, they didn't ask for my ATM card. I went to a studio and recited poetry to play over the vignettes. It definitely wasn't me, and I wasn't comfortable doing it. After this, my spoken poetry was left on the cutting room floor, and I wouldn't talk on TV for another year. Rumors abounded that I would become a deaf-mute wrestler, talk about the final nail in the coffin before I even got started. So this was another interesting bit that was discussed a lot in the biography, is how important it is to talk, for your character. And he figured that it was going to be, it was going to be over for him if he couldn't cut promos. But he said that this would be 1998, by the way. And at this point, he felt like he looked too similar to other wrestlers, that there was a lot of guys with his similar look and build on the company already. And he said one specific wrestler wanted him to cut his hair because he looked too similar to him. That, of course, would probably be Triple H. They didn't say that, which probably tells me that it was probably Triple H, because there's a lot of Triple H shade in his biography that did not come across directly. There was a lot of politicking backstage that, guys didn't like Edge, and, they weren't sure why they didn't like Edge. Like, it was Triple H. All right. We know that it was Triple H who didn't like Edge, and it was Vince who did. Like, that's always sort of been the delineation from what I've seen and heard. And I think Triple H actually said it once in one of these documentaries that they did for Edge. Triple H actually owned up to it, that he was never really an Edge guy and he didn't get it. So this was back in 1998. They're fiddling with his character. They're trying to turn him into a deaf mute. They're not giving him any sort of direction of what the character is or what it should be. So he doesn't know how to perform it or what to do with it. And so he started kind of floundering. But before we get to the floundering part, let's talk a little bit about how he felt about what the lack of direction that he got for the character. This is what he wrote in the book. The vignettes looked cool, but didn't explain much to the crowd, which I was to that point. The problem was that it didn't explain much to me either. Most of my contact with the writers came through Vince Russo, who wanted me to be, quote, a modern-day Jim Morrison. I thought, what do I do? Wander aimlessly down the ramp and flash the crowd with my Lizard King? I think what he wanted was what Jeff Hardy was doing in his final days in WWE. That's great, but it's not me. Then he says he was uncomfortable. He was very uncomfortable with Edge because he didn't know what it was. And then he tells the story of how he came up with the name. How he came up with the name is not discussed at all in the biography, so this is interesting. He says, I wish it was some cool, outlandish story, but it isn't. As a matter of fact, just skip this part. I was driving from Syracuse to Albany with Don. This would be Don Callis, who was working at WWF as a Jackal, throwing around some band names. Finally, the name of the radio station we were on, listening to, dawned on us. It was Edge 10-something. And Don suggested, how about Edge? Although I would have preferred Adam Copeland, it didn't seem like a bad alternative. So that's how he came up with the name Edge. He was sitting in the car with Don Callis, and they came up with it. So, of course, he talked about knocking out Jose in his first match. But before we get into him knocking out Jose, I want to tell the story a little bit of what he wrote in the book about Jose. He says, my first opponent for my debut was one of the Los Berwickwas, Jose Estrada Jr. I had a feeling throughout the day that he wasn't cool with the fact that he was putting me over. Knowing what I do now, I would know he wasn't cool with it. The finish was supposed to be my downward spiral 1, 2, 3, and a nice debut for Edge. Instead, I knocked Estrada out with a helo to the floor. After Timmy White told me he was on Dream Street, I was visibly shaken. I won by a countout and left back through the crowd with JR announcing what an auspicious debut Edge had just made. Wow, thanks for the morale booster. Just what I needed to hear at that point. Jose ended up with some pinched nerves in his neck, and eventually he came back for another short run with the company. But it destroyed his confidence, and he was definitely concerned about the stigma that he was not really going to make it, that he was going to get the stigma of not being safe, and that anybody was going to get hurt working with him. And to him, it was like, okay, now what do I do? And they keep reiterating that people considered him a threat, that he was a threat to them in their spot, even though this was Edge and he wasn't really doing much in 98 or 99. I don't think he was even all that over. So, but it makes sense. He's a young guy. He's got a good look to him. He does look a lot like a lot of other people. He's very athletic. So you kind of want to put the screws to him before he really, put it all together. So about 6 months after Edge debuts, he manages to pull in Christian. So in the book, he writes, Jay and I became two pieces of a puzzle. The third and final piece was Dave Heath, aka Gangrel, a pit bull of a wrestler who had a very cool vampire gimmick. The storyline had Jay, my little brother, brainwashed by Gangrel, and the pair would face off against me. The battle lines had been drawn until the writers decided to go off on a different path. On a subsequent episode of Raw, Gangrel was wrestling Kane and he was on his way to being chokeslammed. Christian made the save and a big red beatdown ensued. As this happened, I hit the ring to supposedly save the day. Instead, I inexplicably joined in the assault and the Brood was born. The Brood was a modern day version of the movie The Lost Boys. Our music kicked ass, which it did, absolutely. Our interest, in my humble opinion, ranks up there with the coolest I've ever seen. The crowd quickly latched onto us. Brood merchandise was made and quickly sold. It felt like we were off and running. We all watched the movie Blade together and used the idea to bloodbath our opponents. It was a strange but effective concept. And once again, the fans dug it. We were supposed to be heels, but our audience didn't care. This was at a time when Stone Cold Steve Austin was on fire and the anti-hero was in. So it says shortly thereafter we were inserted into the Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness, which I think was a mistake. You know, putting them in the Ministry of Darkness was a mistake. Now I know it makes sense. You put what did I call it? When you're doing math, you group like objects. But I feel like, the Brood lost sort of their uniqueness once they were, pushed into the Ministry of Darkness. And they just became like foot soldiers for the Undertaker. But, it was what it was. But in the biography, they basically said, like, hey, were these guys vampires or not? And there's a cool meme going around now that I saw on, I think it was 90s WWE. It's kind of a Jerry Seinfeld meme where it was like, what's the deal with Gangrel? I mean, he's supposed to be a vampire, but he spits out all the blood. And it was pretty funny. But Gangrel, who was in the biography, says that he was basically told, without no uncertain terms, that Edge was going to be the guy. And that they were grooming him. And they were, making sure that he stayed on the right path. And so this was fun. I love the Brood. I think everybody does. So once the Brood had run its course, they take some time in the biography to discuss the importance of being just a wrestler to being an entertainer. And it was time to sort of make that transition. That the sort of dark and somewhat muted versions of Edge and Christian, which had certainly got over, it was time to do something else. They needed to be entertaining. And this was kind of get Edge and Christian off on their own. And they had sort of started to inject a bit of their own goofiness and personalities into the characters. And that started to really work and started to take off. Because, the 5 seconds for flash photography or whatever it was. So that part of his career was the most fun. The most part of the career that I remember from the Attitude Era is the Brood and this part, obviously. I don't remember that much about his solo career because it wasn't much to remember, especially from the early part. Like, a little bit later, yeah. But the early part, I don't remember that much about it. So they talk about, of course, the ladder matches. They spent, a great deal of time on ladder matches. He actually has a ladder in his home gym. It was like a home ring. And he talks about how, ladders make him queasy because he doesn't really touch the ladders anymore. But, the Terry Invitational ladder match between the Hardys and Edge and Christian said it took us from being wrestlers to being entertainers, from being wrestlers to being superstars overnight. And it sort of was a match that Mick Foley kind of gave him a lot of credit for having. Because, Mick Foley is the crash guy. If you can have a match that impresses Foley, then, you're doing good. But the stigma of him not really being tough, of him being a teeny bopper, pretty boy, had become attached to him. Because during the early 2000s, they were doing like the MTV media tours, and it was a lot of Edge and Christian on TRL and stuff like that. So when it was time for him to go solo, and I'm skipping a few years here, after him and Christian broke up, that was sort of the stigma that was attached to him. That Edge as a character was not tough, and he was too pretty, and he felt like that was actually holding him back. So this would be the early 2000s, like from 2000 to 2003, 2004. Now, of course, he ended up injuring his neck in 2003 in the ladder. It wasn't a ladder match; it was like a no disqualification match with Eddie Guerrero. He took a European uppercut, flat backed on the ladder, and cracked some bones in his neck. Ended up getting a surgery, and he tried to not to be depressed because he was, pretty much done. This was the longest time out he had ever had, and he'd been doing this pretty much for several years straight, and had lived one part of his dream, becoming a tag team champion with Christian, that they had manifested it from sixth grade. But now it was time for him to try to reach the ultimate goal. And on that way, he ended up getting hurt. So this was when they was doing the storyline. He was going to be the Evolution Killer. And this storyline was dropped very quickly. And almost nobody talks about it. Almost nobody talks about him being the Evolution Killer. But that's what led to him winning the Intercontinental title from Randy Orton. He's going to beat every member of Evolution one at a time. And I think he might have gotten another injury at the time. But they skipped to SummerSlam 2004, where he gets booed in Toronto. And, he's like, hey, this is my hometown crowd. I'm fresh off of a neck injury. This sucks. But they decided to lean into it. And this is Biography kayfabe. We know that, he was getting booed in 2004 as a babyface, and he was about to become a heel, which was obsessed with winning the title. But we also know that this was around the time that this whole stuff with Lita is about to come out, and people are kind of tired of babyface Edge at this point. I think it had been 3 years of it. He had been getting pushed as a babyface since Edge and Christian broke up, so he hadn't worked as a heel yet. So people are just kind of like, Edge is kind of a guy, he keeps getting hurt, he comes back, he wins a lot. He keeps getting hurt, he comes back, he wins a lot. So in 2004, people just kind of like down on Edge. Who cares about this guy? 2005, he wins the Money in the Bank. But at this point, late 2004, early 2005, he had already turned heel. And he became sort of obsessed with becoming the world champion. So that part of his character is now starting to evolve. And I love it that Undertaker gave him so much credit for saying that he's so much better as a heel, because he really kind of commits to it. They skipped from Money in the Bank, WrestleMania 21, to New Year's Revolution 2006. Again, the big Lita portion of this thing, because the whole Matt Lita stuff blew up in mid-2005. So there's a Matt Lita hole in this biography that is absolutely... It's integral to Edge's story, because that's where all his heat came from. So in the biography, they're trying to get you to believe that Edge was just so good at being a heel that everybody appreciated him. And I was just kind of like, well, not really. It's not really what occurred, but okay. What occurred was, people found out that he was fooling around with Matt's girlfriend. That got him a lot of real life heat. And it translated to on-screen heat, especially when they put him and Lita together. And that's the real story. The biography leaves all of that out, which, to me, I know that the title rehashing it, but, you got to tell the story right in order for people to fully understand. But like I said, they replaced Lita with his mom. They put more emphasis on his mom, less emphasis on Lita. But they should have mentioned the Lita stuff. They should have mentioned it. I'm sorry. They didn't mention it. It's a big, big problem. But he wins the title, and he says that he was told he's only going to be champion for 3 weeks. He's going to drop the title back to Cena. Now, he already knew that it was supposed to be Cena versus Triple H at WrestleMania, and he was pushing to have that match changed. He thought that business had gone up enough, and that with him as the champion, that he should be wrestling Cena at WrestleMania. And I agree with them. If you look at the storyline, it would have been perfect to have Cena versus Edge at WrestleMania. Cena could have won the Royal Rumble and wrestled Edge at WrestleMania. That would have made perfect sense. And it would have been a story from January to April. Unfortunately, they had already planned on Triple H, and so therefore they want to go with Triple H. This is also why Triple H, it's almost like, Triple H saw the future. He's like, I'm going to put the screws to this kid in 98 to prevent him from trying to fuck with me a little bit later. Then almost 10 years later, Edge is there in that very same spot with the title in a hot feud with Cena. And they're like, you know what? Let's cut this thing short. Let's get rid of it, which was a bad decision. They should have gone with Edge and Cena at WrestleMania. But he saw it as an opportunity to change how he's perceived. That now, the whole pretty boy stigma is still attached to him. He's sort of been playing sort of a chicken shit heel character too. So now he needed to add some toughness. And this is where he gets the Foley WrestleMania 22 match, 2007. And he said this is where Adam proves that Edge belonged. And that he needed to get rid of the pretty stigma, the lack of toughness in his character. And the table spot was sort of Foley's idea. So Foley went through all of this work of getting this guy over. And this was tremendous. It was great. And, I was down 100% for this match. Despite the fact that I really don't like death matches, this match was special. Foley's matches were Orton and Edge were very special, as far as quote unquote death matches go, because they were about pushing these new young guys to the limit, putting them through the wars. He was sort of the grizzled vet who was going to take these guys and show the audience these guys have it. They can survive and they can go through it. So Orton and Edge got the baptism by blood from Mick Foley, which was, fantastic. And from there, of course, Edge, goes on to be WWE champion again later that year. And they skipped from 2007 to 2011 when he ends up having to retire. So he gets hit with a chair by Tyrus, the Funkasaurus, and his body went a little bit limp. He didn't have control over his arms anymore. 16 days later, he wrestled at WrestleMania 27 against Alberto Del Rio. And he said he passed all of the strength tests, got MRIs and everything. Everything was fine. But he felt like his arms were still not cooperating. So he did a spear on Tyrus, and it said his arms went limp again. Now he needs a full evaluation. And the result of that is that he has to retire. They found that he has, there's some pinched nerves, and the nerves in his arms are damaged and all that kind of stuff. So he's going to really have strength problems from that point forward. So they're like, no, he's done. And basically he says, the usual. If I'd have known it was going to be my last match, I would have approached it differently. I would have done so much stuff different if I had, known it was going to be my last match, and it wasn't my choice, and he's sort of dealing with that. And from there, we kind of get like the normal Edge fare. He didn't know what he was going to do after he retired. So he kind of starts searching for different things to fill the void. He marries Beth. He has the kids. He starts training for, a comeback several years later after he fell on the bike. So basically stuff that pretty much everybody knows already. So it wasn't really anything special after the Foley Edge stuff at WrestleMania. There was nothing really all that special, unless you're really interested in hearing more about his retirement and neck injuries and stuff like that. Stuff that they've talked about 1,000 times. Now, if you're wondering why I stopped reading book excerpts, it's because the book was written in 2004. It was published in 2004. So it had nothing in there about him winning the title or anything like that. So that should tell you that probably there's likely another book coming at some point. But the biography was fine. The biography was, it wasn't terrible. But like I said, they made some executive decisions over what to include and what not to include. And I liked that they included more of the Bret Hart stuff. They even had footage of him at Bret Hart's home ring, which was great. That stuff is almost always dynamite when it comes to WWE biographies, is the ability to get footage of things and talk to people. They was able to talk to Bret Hart. They was able to talk to his doctors and talk about his injuries. So that was great. But the stuff that they left on the cutting room floor is, it's that, I'm saying, you can't, I understand, you don't want to speak too much about it, but you can't leave the Matt Hardy Lita stuff laying on the floor. You can't do it. To me, it's just too much of an important part of the story, especially considering they have both kayfabe and on-screen and off-screen relationships. And as far as Lita and the Hardy Boys were a thing on screen, Lita and Matt Hardy was a thing on screen, And now Lita is with Edge. So the characters in the real life cinch up so much. It's poetic in a sense of the story of heartbreak for Matt Hardy and the heartbreaker being Edge. It works perfectly. You know, it's a story that pretty much every average guy can understand. You are a normal, well-adjusted, you know, fairly handsome guy, fairly good-looking guy. You can get yourself a hot girlfriend. But every guy's dream is that he's going to lose his hot girlfriend to either his cool best friend or some other cool guy. And in this, Matt Hardy's instance, it's a cool, good friend. Maybe not best friend, but cool, good friend. Somebody he knows personally steals his girlfriend. It's a nightmare scenario. And it's a situation that, for some reason, I understand it, because, you know, Lita has complained for years about how she didn't want to talk about it and how it's too much of an overshadow of the rest of her career. And the WWE always is trying to portray these characters in the best light possible in these biographies, especially this season. Last season, they didn't mind throwing some dirt around. On this season, though, they're really protecting their IP. They're not going to damage the IP of Edge by, you know, they want Edge to be a family man now. That's part of his gimmick. Part of his gimmick now is that he's a family man. Well, I wouldn't even call it a gimmick. It's part of his character now. Is that he's not really the rated R superstar anymore. But he is sort of a family guy who could be pushed too far. And in doing so, they have to eliminate the most important part of his fucking career, because that's the only reason he became champion in the first place, is because they decided to use the real life heat between him and Matt. But then, this is what the weirdest thing about it is that they used it on Rivals. And, you know, they talked about Lita during the Rivals episode with John Cena. So it's like, that's so weird to me that they would leave it out of the biography, but they would use it for Rivals. What? Okay. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the biography. The biography was fine. You know, it was really emotional, you know, talking about his mom. And, of course, how motivational Beth was, how Beth kind of took over the mom role, you know, which, you know, mommy wife. But, you know, if she cares about you, she should be a little motherly, I guess, a little bit caring. But ultimately, it was nice to see that he had all of his childhood drawings of, you know, what he wanted his character to look like and all that kind of stuff. That was really fun. But again, the biography is definitely hindered by WWE choosing to not discuss things that pretty much everybody knows with the widely available audience, to show like, hey, this happened and this is why the guy got so much heat. This would help him get over, you know, help people really, really dislike him. But they felt like they didn't need to put it in there. But let me know what you guys think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.